Hey guys, welcome to another episode of LFA's Chop Shop. This week we're working on the toyoace and we're going to do some steering stuff and we're going to make the intake actually fit. Alright, so this episode, I have a list. I'm not going to read it to you, let's just get into it. Alright, so the first job for today is to make a support bearing for this steering box. So I went and bought a rose joint, or whatever you want to call it. So that goes on the bottom shaft, and then I need to make a bracket for it to pick up on, so that when you turn the steering wheel, there's no pressure in this, like deflection. So it's all going to be nice and solid. So what I've got is this guy to work with, and I've already cut a piece of angle line to go in there like that. So I'm going to weld it to probably this steering support. Then I'm going to have to adjust the accelerator pedal, but I don't like what I did anyway, so I'm going to have to play with that at a later date. But for now, I can weld that guy on there, and then we can put that bearing in place. Alright, so the first order of business for this is to drill a hole this way, so that this can be bolted to the angle line. That way I can put it on the steering and then get everything lined up. Alright, so between my camera shutting off and me having a tantrum, I have a solution. So this rose joint, or whatever you want to call it, was a little bit too small for this shaft, which is really annoying. So I took some burrs off of the shaft and then ended up opening up the rose joint just a tiny little bit. So it fits really nice now. So that's a piece of angle line that's quite thick. So hopefully that's good enough. And then this is like 6mm plate or something that I'm going to bolt through to this other 6mm plate, which is the steering column. So I need to run a weld across here, drill some holes, bolt it together, and then make the rest of this piece stronger. But because there's a bit of overlap, I'm not really sure how I'm going to do that. So it probably will be fine like it is. Probably will be fine without all of this, but I'd like to try and reinforce this somehow. I may do that later. But for now, if I can get that welded and get the steering back in, get this painted, bolted in, everything, I'll be pretty happy. Then I can move on to accelerator and pedals shortly, and then I can make a plate to go in here to cover it all up and put a nice little grommet around the steering and all that sort of stuff. So, welder. Alright, so getting this bearing in here was pretty miserable. So I've made the angle line here weld to this big plate, put some big bolts through that nut on the back. So that fits really nicely and bolts up really nicely. Getting this in is super awkward, but it is pretty free, so that's nice. It's not touching on the actual housing, so that's all good. The next thing to do is put the nut on the back of this, but there's actually a piece of metal in the way that I need to clearance to do that nut up. And I also don't have the right size spanner, so I have to do it with a shifter, but a shifter doesn't really fit in there, so that's a bit awkward. But then once that's done, then I can bolt the steering back together, which is currently just sitting up there. And then once I've got the other pedal sorted, I can make some kind of cover. So we're getting there, it's just a bit awkward. So the next job to do is weld on some captive nuts to the bottom of these plates for the seat, and they will go through the engine cover into the nut so that it'll hold the seat down. So that's all good. I won't bore you with that, I'll just do it, but that's the thing that needs to be done. So I'll jump into that and then we'll go on with the list. Alright, so the next job for today is to rebend this dipstick for the engine. So this one I've bent really poorly with a brake line tool, and it's a bit clunky getting in and out of the tube. So I've got another one. I'll pull this out and use it as a reference and bend up the other one with the actual pipe bender. Alright, so they're the bends that I did with the brake line tool. So I'm going to try and bend it with this actual pipe bender. Try and make it a little bit nicer and a bit more gradual. So hopefully this works pretty well. I'll give it a go and we'll find out. Alright, a little bit of back and forth, and we've got a bit more gradual of a curve. This thing slips in there heaps nicer than the other one, so it doesn't try and unwind itself now, whereas the other one did, because the actual dipstick is twisted. So when you pull this one out here, it's too tight and it wants to spin the stick, whereas this one comes out nicely. So now I just need to cut this bracket off and weld on a new one, and it's going to be mounted to the exhaust manifold because it needs to move with the engine, and there's not much else over there where this is going to end up. Alright, so I messed that up, so this one's useless and I can't even get the dipstick out of it now. And then the original one I put back in, so I've straightened that out a bit and then rebent it. And it's okay, but it still twists when it comes out. So now what I need to do is make a bracket to hold it to the headers. So I'm a little bit annoyed, but I can't do it again because I've only got two. So as it was, I already got one off a Dale. So you pull this out and it twists a little bit, which I'm going to have to deal with. And then what I'm going to do is use that bolt hole off the top of that header flange and then go up to the dipstick. So I'll cut this up and weld it in and show you when I'm done. Alright, so the new bracket welded to the dipstick. I hate it, and if you've got a dipstick, let me know and I'll grab it off here because I want to redo this already. But that'll do it for now. It'll hold it in, bolts up to the exhaust manifold, and it should be pretty sweet. Alright, so there's the dipstick in place, mounts off the header bolt just here, and comes out with a bit of a twist. So it'll work. I'm annoyed about it, but it'll work, and you can get to it outside the truck. So on to the next one, which is the trans dipstick, which I mounted in a previous episode. So originally I was going to have the bigger muffler here and the smaller muffler there, so swap these two around, but I didn't do that in the end. So I need to point this out the side of the car rather than into that muffler. So I need to undo the bracket that's on this guy, spin it around and remount it. Alright, so I ripped out the old bracket, which was just this piece of bar with a bit of a twist in it, put in a slightly longer one and move the dipstick over here, so now I can get it out from over the top. So that's the dipsticks done. On to the next job. Alright, so with that done, the next job is to get onto the air filter. So I want to get it above the radiator instead of pointing at the ground. Alright, so I bought some bends, you versus the guy she told you not to worry about. So these ones are for the cooling system, and that's for Aiden to do the cooling system because it's aluminium. And then this one is a 4-inch stainless bend, so that's for the intake, so the air filter. So I need this bend to make the air filter come out of the engine, come down a little bit, go over across the top of the front radiator, and it will also give me clearance for the hoses for the front radiator to the heater system on the engine. So let's cut this up and try and get in the front of the car. Alright, so before I get too committed with this air filter, I've chucked it in above the radiator. So what I'm going to do is get that new bend and come out of the air filter along and then curve up into this old bend which is already there. So to do that, I want to try and shorten all of this because there's actually not much room. So I'll cut this silicon down, probably end up cutting this bend down, maybe taking some of the bend out of it so it's only say 80 degrees instead of 90 degrees, and then the same with the other one, just to get that bend nice and hopefully into that filter above the radiator. So I'll take this off and see what I can do. Alright, so I've shortened the bend a little bit at this end, which I forgot to film. Then I clamped on the hose clamp, so that silicone is on as far as it can go. So I probably need to clean up this edge because it's pretty bad. But I can take about 30mm off of this end to make it a bit shorter again. So I've got a 25mm piece of RHS and a fresh razor blade. We're going to put this silicone face down like this and then run it up against the razor blade and try and cut 25mm off this thing. Alright, I'm not sure how obvious it is, but I've cut probably 10mm off of this pipe, 25mm off of this guy, and then scooched it all as tight as I can, and then I've trimmed up the other end just to make it nice and neat. So there should be a fair bit more room now. I think I'm still going to be fighting for room at the other end. So I'll jump underneath and see if I've got any more room. Alright, it's basically impossible to show you, but this fits above the radiator and to that pipe now. But it's all very tight and touching, so I need to take a bit more off. So I'm going to try and take an inch off of this pipe here, and hopefully I can fit it in there and hopefully I don't take too much off of it. And then we want to get the filter in here, kind of level. So I'll take an inch off. I think I need to probably take 2, but I'll just go little bit by little bit and try and get this thing in there. Alright, to take an inch off of this, I need to weld this pipe back on there. So I'll do a couple of good tacks and then I'll try and jig it all up again, cut like an inch off of here. And then if I need to cut more, I can tack this back together. And if not, then we should be home free. So let's tack these together and cut them up. Alright, tack together. Let's cut off entirely too much and then have to try and work out how to fix it. Alright, so here's a slightly better look at what I'm trying to do here. So obviously this is pointing up far too much and is way too long and is also touching the radiator. So I need to make it all a little bit shorter. So the joint is just behind that wiring there. So I think I'm going to take a little bit more off the top bend try and bring this guy up and also flatten it out a little bit. I don't want to take too much off, obviously. I'd like to just sneak up on it, so I'll keep creeping and try and take a little bit away. And then once I'm happy with it, I can cut this length down so that the filter can fit and screw on, bolt up back there. Alright, I was wrong. This is the cut that I get wrong and make too short. So it's getting really close. I need to add a little bit of straight, so I'm going to try and cut it a little bit longer on that end and actually flip this pipe up the other way. So this will be the top and that'll be the filter end. So if this cut goes well, it should fit hopefully pretty good. We'll see. Alright, I genuinely think I've cut it about 6 or 7 times and I've ground it back a little bit. So it's all tacked together. And let's chuck it in and see if it all fits. Alright, that's perfectly ridiculous. So I need to line up the logo when I put it in for real. It doesn't touch the front radiator there. It's super awkward to show you guys this thing, but it is in there and it's not actually touching anything, which is amazing. So it would need a mount at some point, but for now, that's where we're at. I'll try and get you a better angle. Alright, so from underneath, that's the filter there. It swoops up and then into the engine. This is really hard to show you, but it does clear everything, just. And then from the top, which is probably easier to show you from here. So we've got the original bend there, new bend down there, and the filter. So the wiring is just sitting on it, but I should have enough room to move that out the way and strap it to something else. So it does fit. I'm going to call that a win and leave it here for now. Alright, it's a new day, it's rainy and horrible. Let's get this thing out of here, fully weld it, clean it up, give it a coat of paint, and then put it back in. I probably still need to do a bracket at a later date, but I don't think I'll do that today. And then I've got one more job and I can finish this episode. Alright, with the intake fully welded and painted, it looks pretty good. Some of the welds are pretty bad, but I've ground back a bunch of them. Nice penetration on the inside, so it'll be fine. There's no wire or anything in there. And I wiped out all of the swarf, so it should be all sweet. Alright, now with the air filter finally fitting, let's move into the cab and move on to the next job. Alright, so inside the cab I've collected a few bits for future jobs. So I need to put on one of the front indicators. I need to put a headlight in, and then I've got 2 bolts ready to go in for the cab mounts. So I'll start with the cab mounts and then I'll move on to the headlight and the indicator. Alright, so there is the cab mount bolted in place. Hopefully I don't have to undo that again, unless the motor's coming out, I guess. Which I don't really want to do, because there's a lot of stuff to take off. Alright, next thing. Alright, so with the cab mounts in, let's grab this headlight, let's get those screws out, let's get it all together. Alright, so with this headlight, I need to get these 4 bolts out. So this one's already out, this one's already snapped, and those 2 are pretty stuck in there. So I'm going to spray some goo on those 2 and try and get onto this one, work out a way I can weld to it and try and get it out. But there is a rubber seal the whole way around, which I don't really want to take off because it's pretty hard. So there we go, I'll spray those 2 first and we'll get into it. Alright, so I've sprayed some goo on here. I can get to the back as well, so I've sprayed some on the back. Hello, bud. And then worst case, if they do break off, I can drill them out and put some nutserts in there if I have to. So I'll leave that soak for a little bit and I'll move on to this indicator Parker lens thingy. So this goes on the front valance and I need to make it all screw together. So I've not really looked at it yet, but I need to fix it and make it bolt on. Alright, so there's the headlight and the rear axis, so it's not too bad. And this is the light I'm talking about. So I need to make this pile of parts bolt on and fit. So it looks like that side. Alright, so most of this stuff is pretty okay. I need to find 3 screws to mount the actual lens, which is fine. And then the 2 back mounting bolts are both snapped off. So I'm going to have to cut those off and weld something new on. So I'll get some donor bolts and we'll try and get into it. Alright, so I've got 3 matching screws that hold the lens on nicely. So now I've got 2 M6, just 25mm long. I'm going to try and replace these broken studs. Alright, so my plan is and try and grind these down so they're nice and flat. There's a little like extra thick bit, and I'll drill through there and tap it to M6. Then I'll put the M6 bolts in from this side and then take the heads off and just weld them in from this side. And then they should have a nice thread out the back. They should be pretty smooth on the front and the lens should still fit. I do not expect this to be easy, so I'm going to chuck you on time lapse and I'm just going to keep going until it's done. Wish me luck. Alright, so that actually wasn't totally misery. Got the threads welded back on there. So obviously not going to be super strong, but should be enough to hold this little light on. So once this cools down and the paint dries, I can chuck it back on the car. Alright, so that's the light that was originally there. That's the one we've just done. So it's a little bit cleaner, but it is bolted on nicely. So pretty happy with that. Let's move on to this headlight, try and get those bolts out. Hopefully get that bolted up, and then the front, other than the grille and the bumper, is all done. Alright, so I fixed the threads for the bucket and it's bolted on loosely, and then I cannot get the light to actually fit again. So you're going to get this piece of thread that kind of just hangs out, and you need to thread it in a bolt hole, and I don't understand how to do it with one person. Dale came over and I conned him into helping me fit this headlight again. The rubber washer grommet thing that seals the headlight to the back of the cowl panel has actually shrunk a little bit, so I cut a little bit of that away. We put the headlight back together and then it slotted in from the back. So that is the headlights and the fog lights back in, or the indicators or whatever they're going to be. So I still need to do the bumper and the grille, but I'll leave those until I've got the brakes going and everything else mechanically working, because that can all wait. Alright, let's chuck this intake back in now that the paint is dry, and bolt it all up for good, and then pull it out later and put a bracket on it. Alright, got the intake back on. Definitely need to make a mount down there, but that can wait for later. So I'm going to call that a win. Alright, so that's all we have time for this week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. A few more things off the list. There's another list next week, and we'll get into that then. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.